I have been doing conflict transformation work in our annual conference and around the denomination for the last 15 or 20 years. And we had a conflict resolution team for quite a few years in our conference, and I was the lead for that. And so I've been in a lot of churches with a lot of different things going on, and I've seen, you know, fights where we had to call the police to manage a staff parish relations committee meeting, and all the way to people being so angry at each other they couldn't even look at each other. And by the end of the time together, they were hugging and forgiving one another. So it's very powerful, transformative work. It requires a little bit of courage, chutzpah, right? To be part of the peace builders, the building of peace. And I'm hoping that one of the reasons that you joined the call tonight was because you want to be a builder of peace in the faith community where you are, that the skills that you want to really tone or hone are that about building peace. And so I'm glad that you're here, and perhaps it'll be a journey that we travel for a little bit tonight. You know, in the middle of the pandemic, what goes on in our churches has been really different with regard to change and with regard to conflict. And it's been a different time for everything. And we've had to make adjustments and pivot, et cetera, Even the way that we manage conflict you'll note, is a little bit different than perhaps we would have handled it prior to the pandemic, based on where people are. And so I want to start with that place and tell you about that. So I'm going to share my screen. So everybody can see the managing conflict in a sea of change, right? All right. So I wanted to talk about the rate of change. And I imagine that in every congregation right now, you've been through rapid change. You know, we've been required to pivot on a dime in order to facilitate what we could do during the pandemic. You know, maybe your church was open one week and closed the next. Maybe you had to install cameras in order to do a different kind of worship. Maybe you were doing Zoom worship from home and then Zoom from church. It's been quite a roller coaster ride. And what we know is that for the first 4 to 5 months, the whole world was in that rapid transition, rapid change zone. And everybody pretty much went along with what we were doing, right? Maybe you didn't get a whole lot of pushback as leaders in your congregations. However, that goodwill feeling has dried up a little bit. People are tired of the pandemic. People are tired of change. The world is still changing daily. And the one thing that people don't want to be to see change around is their church, right? So we've run out, in a way, we've run out of the goodwill that we've had for the first few months of the pandemic. People now want steadiness, and they want normalcy, and they want things to stay the same. All right, so what we know, though, what happens with conflict is the faster the change, the greater the potential for conflict. And so, you know, in the midst of pastoral transitions, we know that's a significant potential for conflict during those times. And then add on to that everything else that's been going on, and you see why we are where we are. It would be great if you could raise your hand if you've had conflict in the last 6 months within the life of your congregation. Can we see, Frank, can you see the number of hands? Because I can't Yep.
I got my hand up. Let's see who else.
I'll come back to that in a second. So we don't like conflict. Chances are nobody really is a fan of conflict. And there are a number of reasons. When you're kind of involved in an argument or disagreement with someone else, there are sometimes physical implications. Maybe you get a migraine. Maybe you get high blood pressure. And people don't like to be engaged in conflict. And so oftentimes what happens is they just go away. So in church conflicts, if you walk into a church and there's on a Sunday morning and there's not the usual hub of conversation, my instinct, my red flag goes up and says, I bet some people have walked away. And there's like a kind of just a sense that there is not well-being there in the midst. People also don't like debate. We see debate on the national stage all the time. People don't mind dialogue, but in general, they don't like debate, at least not in church. What do we learn? Some of our gut theologies about conflict. You don't fight when you go to church. Maybe your mom told you that. You got to be nice to each other. We got to forgive one another. And so what happens is when things come up, people get angry. They don't know how to deal with it because church is very different than, kind of hammering it out with somebody that you live with, right? It might be a whole lot easier to do it with people that you know very, very well, as opposed to church, because somebody told us along the way that we shouldn't argue or disagree at church. It happens anyway. And quite frankly, conflict is a normal part of church life. If you think about the things that you've been in conflict about over the last month or so, it's the things you care about the most. And when people love their church, it just makes sense that they value it highly. There's going to be conflict around some of those things. So what happens when there's conflict at church? People begin to express some irrational behaviors or make impulsive decisions or quick assumptions about the other. If someone looks at you, or you see two people talking, sometimes we make the assumption, oh, they must be talking about me. Those kinds of things. There's anger, there's frustration, a lot of emotions. And what we know is that we are not at our best in conflict. We make assumptions, we act irrationally, we may say something that we regret later. We just, it's a given that we are not at our best in conflict. So I want to show you one more slide, and then I want to just ask a question or two. People come to church because it's a safe space. It's sacred space. In order to be safe, it has to be, or in order to be sacred, it has to be safe. If you misspell the word sacred, rearrange 3 letters, you get the word scared. And those are totally opposite of one another. So if somebody comes to church expecting to have sacred space, which is safe, sanctuary, and it becomes a place of conflict and they don't like conflict, then it's going to feel very different. And when it's scared, when they're frightened or it's scary space, it loses that sense of comfort for a lot of people. So what can we do to manage the conflict so that people find the sacred space that they need? And that's what I want to help you do tonight through this presentation. I'm going to get right back to it in just a minute, but I'd like to see you for a minute and ask a question or two. Maybe you could raise your hand. Now I can see everyone. How many people have been in a conflict situation in their church in the last year? Raise your hand. It's been a little tough, I guess, because of the pandemic. Okay. And how about, how many folks are laity? Would you raise your hand if you're laity? Great. And in positions of leadership? Okay, super. So everyone on the call tonight has a responsibility within the life of their congregation. And so we're going to focus on kind of congregational life and what we can do as laity and as clergy in order to facilitate the best response in the midst of conflict. If you do not have conflict in your church right now, what you are going to receive is an opportunity to learn some skills that will help things move forward without, so that when conflict does come up, you will be able to handle it and manage it very well, right? So that hopefully it'll be a smoother days going forward. All right. So I'm going to share my screen again. So when there is a sacred space, it's sacred because we're not doing these things. We're not trying to convict someone of, saying you're wrong. This is your fault. We're not trying to convince someone, or convert somebody to our way of thinking. Those are particularly powerful words in that they express, kind of just a hard core or somewhat of a manipulative perspective. So if we are in a sacred space, we want to listen, learn, and lament. So we may disagree with one another. I bet everybody could raise their hand if you've ever had a disagreement with somebody else in the life of the church, right? And I can't imagine that. If we're saying things and we care deeply about our church, chances are we've not always agreed on everything. And if we truly want it to be sacred space, we will get better at listening, learning, and lamenting with each other. And the lament, is all three of those, listen, learn, and lament, are very biblical. The lament is, gosh, I'm grieved that we don't agree, but let's figure out how we can still be together as we go forward. Our denomination right now is in a very precarious space in terms of some of the issues that are confronting us. And we've spent the last 16 or so years, some of the time, trying to convict or convince or convert, but also listening and learning and lamenting. And our hope is, my hope is that where we come out at the end of this, maybe at the end of this general conference, will be in a place that where we can say with confidence that we have listened to one another and learned from each other and lamented, regardless of the action that we choose to take. I think that would just be a great way to move forward. That just turned colors on me. All right, I'm going to move on to this next slide. Frank, they're moving around.
You okay?
Yes. So here, yeah. So as leaders in our congregation, if we focus, I actually have on cards that I make for people, a little card that they carry in their wallet are these three things. What is your role in the midst of conflict when there's those conversations that begin or arguments that come up? First of all, is to remember that we are gods, right? So to be gods. And then secondly is to discern God's call. What does God want out of this? Not my will, but your will, oh God. And then third is to express God's love in spite of all of the things that happen. And if you think about what Jesus did in the times when he encountered conflict, or when he purposely caused conflict, he first and foremost always reminded the people that of the God, his Father in heaven, right? That he was always pointing toward God in whatever he did. And he was always listening. He prayed, so many times we hear of Jesus praying. He found the strength, he knew Judas was going to betray him, if you read the story of the Last Supper. But he went and prayed and prayed. He was looking for the discernment that he needed. And finally, even though, he was crucified, he says from the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So to remind ourselves that we are God's, we belong to God, discern God's call, share God's love. I guarantee if you carry that around with you, if you constantly keep that in mind for yourself as a leader in the church, that will make a huge difference in the way that you respond. Because remember, we are not at our best in the midst of conflict. All right. So what do you do? How do you assess conflict? What happens when conflict comes calling in your congregation? So here's the A, B, C, D, E of conflict, and we're going to look at them one at a time. So the first part is assessment. And if you look down the column, the first letter of each of those words, it spells rivers, R-I-V-I-R-S, slightly misspelled, right? River, but it's rivers. And this particular piece is from the Alban Institute. So this one is not one that I designed or created, but this particular one is of the Alban Institute. So they talk about the reasons or the way that organizations get into conflict. And so I just wanted to go through each of those. First is about relationship. So right now, if everybody would think of a conflict that they've had either in their life or in their church over the last 12 months, I want you to just jot it down so you can think about it. And I'm going to go through these things, and you can identify what kind of conflict it is. So is it a conflict about relationships? Relationship between the pastor and the trustees, for example. Relationship between two staff members. A relationship between pastor and a layperson, or two laypersons. So that's the first kind of conflict, is relationships. The second one is around information. That's the first I. So in your congregation, is there a lack of information? Is there misinformation? Are there unclear information systems? So like oftentimes a prayer chain will end up being a source of misinformation instead of accurate, correct information. Sometimes the parking lot meetings that happens after the administrative board meeting is the place where a lot of information gets distributed. What happens with information is that when there is a lack of information, people fill in the voids. So if you don't have all the facts, and nobody does it maliciously, generally, but when there's a lack of information, people will fill in the blanks because the person who has information has power. So when there's a lack of transparency, that's what happens. People begin to make assumptions because we're not at our best in conflict, and information becomes misinformation. Missing or misinformation. So that's the second kind of conflict that churches often get into. That's a very common one. The next part is values. There there, you know, that's part of what the denomination right now around LGBTQ, that's a values conflict. We have different perspectives about that. A values conflict may be around, should we use the building for community groups, or do we want to preserve it and not have it get messed up? You know, it can be a values conflict. How we read the Bible sometimes is also a values conflict. Shall we offer several different kinds of worship services, or should we stick to what we do and what we have done for the last 30 years that really truly defines the way we are as a church? Okay, so values conflict. Interest, those two sometimes can overlap a bit. Interest conflicts are around, shall we take a team of volunteers to Puerto Rico to do missions work, or to downtown in Philadelphia, say, for instance, because there's a great need for mission work right there in downtown Philadelphia. Why would we want to send a team all the way to Puerto Rico to work when we have work to do right here downtown? That would be one perspective. The other perspective, of course, is why would we want to just limit ourselves to staying downtown when getting away with a group of people gives us a broader perspective of the world? And, you know, we know that the world is our parish. All right, so different interests kind of connects a little bit, overlap a little bit with values. Resources. This is an interesting one, and oftentimes we see this in churches, particularly because of the pandemic. So for the first couple of months, churches were doing great financially, but that's shifting. 2021 is going to be worse than 2020 for churches. People are tired of the pandemic, and yet we still do not have everything back to normal. Some of our church people, right, cannot or won't come back until after they've been vaccinated. So there's a lot of missing resources that we usually count on for the budget or for doing mission and ministry. And so that lack of resources is a cause of conflict. Having to make decisions around the budget that is a reduced budget is critical. Your annual conference has been working through some of that as well. There are a couple of churches I'm aware of that I've worked with where they had an overabundance of resources. Say your congregation received a $5 million endowment or a bequest from a family, and it was all to be used for the education ministry. Can you imagine that that would cause conflict? Well, what is it that describes education ministry? How are we going to utilize that money? And then others would say, well, why can't we use it for anything else? Can't we use it to add on to the building? You know, what's education? What is it? What about the education of the community? Can we build a library with it? Because that's education related. So you can see that the abundance of resources often can be an issue as well. The lack of resources in terms of shared space is another place where there's conflict often. You know, if you're sharing your space with a daycare, with scout groups, with, you know, the place doesn't always get left the way you expected. And so that sharing of resources in terms of building space is another source of conflict. And then finally, structure. When there's an unclear organizational structure, this gets folks into conflict very easily. So if we're doing a ham and oyster dinner for fundraising, who sets the amount of money that costs per ticket? Is it the ham and oyster dinner committee who know how much the oysters cost? Is it the finance committee who knows how much they want to make out of this fundraiser for the budget? Or is it the United Methodist Women who do all the work? Who gets to set, the cost? All right, so that's the structure. A structure kind of conflict. All right, so I'm giving you a couple of tools that you can use to talk about the conflict. Here's the second one related to assessment, and then I'm going to pause for a moment. So if I were to work with your church as a mediator, there's a couple things I'd want to know. I'd want to know, based on Rivers, what kind of conflict are you dealing with? And secondly, what level of conflict is there? Is it simply a difference of opinion? Or has it elevated to a disagreement between two people or between two groups? Is it a conflict, which means that there is a specific issue that people are disagreeing about, and there doesn't seem to be a place of compromise or a place of common ground? By level 4, you're going to need a mediator. By level 4, there are sides that have been drawn. There are spokespersons for each side. Some have chosen to fight. Others have chosen to leave because they don't want to deal with conflict. People don't like conflict often. And then level 5 is the place of divorce, the place where the conflict is intractable and the organization as it exists is destroyed. Something may rise as a result, but in general, it isn't going to continue on as it hasn't previously. So there is destruction to the organization. All right, I'm going to stop there for a moment. That's a lot of information. But what we've covered is to understand what our role is, how we can be a builder of peace in that conflict, but acknowledging that there are going to be conflicts. And here's a way for you as a church leader to assess the kind of conflict that's going on in your church. And it gives you a language to use in those instances. So most churches, or most church leaders.
Ingredients in one cream. Don't settle for less. Vitamin triple power. Plus hyaluronic acid.
Most churches get to that point where there is a conflict going on, and if you share with your leadership, say, let's figure out what kind of conflict we're dealing with here. Looking at Rivers, what are we actually talking about? Giving people that common language, that common vocabulary to share about a conflict really helps assess that conflict in a very helpful way. So you get them to do that, and then you say, okay, well, what level of conflict are we dealing with? Are people calling each other names? Are we sure what the issue is? If the issue has kind of gone underground and it really has become more about personalities, then you know that you're at a level 4 conflict. All right, so let me pause for a moment. Are there any questions that people have? We were gonna invite you to stick them into the chat, or should I keep on going?
And I don't think anybody has any conflict here at all, right?
Karen?
Yes.
Before we get to assess conflict level, this is my finding that whether the pastor contributed to the conflicting situation or not, pastor usually is in the middle of that conflict.
Yes, so here's a statement that's true 90% of the time. Pastor, you are either with me or against me. So if you're not with me, then you must be against me, right?
Mhm.
So 90% of the time, whether the pastor's involved or not, the pastor is in the conflict. It's just a matter of, that's the role of the leader, right? So and for the pastors that are on the call, there's no hope of staying neutral.
Mhm.
I mean, so you don't want to take sides, especially if it's really not about you. And you can't remain neutral because assumptions are going to be made about you and about where you stand. So the best thing to do is to be proactive and become a builder of peace. And that's what I'm hoping that we get out of this. That rather than be a passive victim and be accused of being on one side or the other, be active and in building peace. In my experience, the clergy that do that, and oftentimes, and I do coaching now around helping clergy become builders of peace, rather than be victimized by the conflict going on in their local churches. So one of the things that the foundation offers is coaching services. And that's one of the things that we help clergy with. All right, I'll keep on moving forward here. You're going to get a copy of these slides. So this also is a help for you. I'm helping, these slides are intended for church leaders to be able to deal with conflict on your own without my help, right? So once you do the assessment of the level of conflict, the kind of conflict, these are two questions you'd want to ask. What would it look like for conflict to be at a lower level? So imagine a better future, and what needs to change for that to happen. And then you might want to think about too, what role can you play to see that it gets to a level 2? This one is, pot shots are something that happens a lot in churches. And clergy will often fall prey to those. Somebody may be having a rough time in life, and they say on a Sunday morning as they're leaving, I'm not coming back. You didn't visit my mother in the hospital. Or why don't you preach on sin more often? I want to go to a church where they're preaching on sin more often. Or I'm upset because we don't sing the kind of music that I like. But generally, you know, when somebody takes a pot shot at a church leader or the pastor, it is because a person is hurting, is in opposition to the ministry, or is testing. It goes back to, so if you're in a new appointment, you will often get tested in those first few months, especially, just to kind of see where you're coming from. So it's important to remember that as a clergy person, when the pot shots are thrown your way, that's really not about you. And if you think about, you know, where the other person is coming from, you might discover that they're either hurting or opposing the ministry for one reason or another, or it's a test. So I threw that in as just a little extra there. All right, so when we're in the midst of conflict, so right up to this point, we've been talking about the way that we would respond, help the organization, help the church respond. But we also have a responsibility in the way that we personally respond as individuals. And so I'm hopeful that the next couple slides actually prepare you to respond not just at church, but in your family life or at work, or, you know, some other arena in your life. So hopefully this is just in general helpful for everyone in the way that they respond to conflict. These are the typical ways that we respond as human beings. We respond as a martyr. We lay down and take it. we say, oh, it's all my fault. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And when it isn't our fault. All right, so that's the martyr part. It must be my fault. I don't know why. That's the martyr. The warrior, right? Warrior is somebody that says it's not my fault. It never will be. It's never my fault, right? It's somebody else's fault all the time. There's no responsibility. It's got to be somebody else, and I'm gonna forcefully figure out who it is to make sure that there is a scapegoat in this process. The third one is avoid. There's no conflict here. And if there is, the person would rather and prefer to leave the room. All right, so the avoider of conflict, we'll deal with this later. Somebody comes up to you and says, we have a real decision to make. Is it going to be red carpet in the sanctuary or blue carpet? And we have 3 people that on either side of that issue. This is going to be a huge problem. And we need the carpet yesterday. An avoider says, well, let's talk about this next month. Just push it down the road. And finally, the warrior. The warrior plays a very important role in this, in garnering support. So if somebody says, Pastor, your newsletter article caused great amount of discouragement among the people. You claim that we are a church in decline, and we don't see ourselves that way. But the fact that you said that about us makes us very angry. And then the pastor would say, oh no, I wonder who the we is. And then goes and says to 3 other people individually, are you offended by what I said? I can't believe that so-and-so, so the warrior is the one who raises the anxiety level in an organization beyond where it is by going around and individually consulting with people to find those that agree with their point of view, but also then to disparage the ones that do not agree. So a warrior causes increased stress in the organization. So none of those responses, because remember, we're not at our best in conflict. None of those are ideal, but we have the opportunity and the power within us, thanks to our faith, to move those from where they are to a more healthy response. Let me show you what they would be. So rather than a martyr, oh, poor me, it's my fault, I'm so sorry, to caregiver. Wow, you really sound like you could use some support. How might I help care for you during this time? All right, so it's moving from yourself as the focus to the other. So it's not about me, but it's about you and what I can do to help you, to focus on you. So from warrior to builder of peace, to peace builder. All right, so rather than, get all excited and I'm gonna fight about this, what can we do together to move forward? An avoider, you're moving from avoiding to embracing. So instead of running away from conflict, running toward the one with whom there is conflict, and offering words of comfort, words of peace. And then finally, the warrior to a non-anxious presence. So rather than, go and spread the word about the newsletter article that I used as an example, become a non-anxious presence. let's talk about how we, what that was about and how we might move forward. So that we have the power to respond in a healthy way that will promote peace and transformation of the conflict. So when we think about the way that we kind of our default response and we shift it to kind of the godlike response, that's what we come up with. So the B, we were doing the A, B, C, D, E, was to, and I'm just going to go through this one and the next one a little quickly. And so we want to embrace common values, common ground. Here are some questions that you could use to discover what the common ground is, because that is really the way that we're going to begin to rebuild after conflict. You know, what is it? We're focused on the extraneous. We need to get back to our core vision and mission. Who does God want us to be? And then the C clarifies what it means to have conflict around. What would it look like? Always focusing, helping people to take the next step. You know, we've been fighting about this for the last 6 months. What would it look like? What would it feel like to no longer be in conflict about this? What's at stake if we stay in conflict? So let's figure out what that, you know, how we're going to feel good again about being together. And that often those kinds of clarifying questions help a church move beyond the conflict, because what they realize is it's destructive. To stay engaged in unhealthy conflict causes destruction in the life of a church. And oftentimes, most times, churches don't want to be there. They want to be in a better spot. And so these are the kinds of questions that leaders can ask and wrestle with together that will move a church from where they are in conflict to their future, a preferred future. And so you take the best of what you've talked about. You imagine the best and you write down some key moves that you're willing to make together to move forward. So you find the bright spots, you clarify, you know, what can we do that's going to move us forward? Yes, we don't agree on this one thing, but let's imagine the best in our disagreement. And then finally, you got to get people working with you. And that final question there, what do we do well? How can we do more of it? We might have to set aside the conflict so that we can focus more on what we do well and how we can do more of it. So engaging people in an action plan using appreciative inquiry. And the appreciative inquiry is that question. It's coming at it from a place of appreciation for what we do well. All right. I just have a couple more slides, but before I go there, we kind of, yeah, I'll just do them real quick because they're very short. This is what happens when we we are in the hot seat, right? We make negative assumptions about the other. If two people are talking and there's been conflict around, we're going to assume they're talking about us. We dread encounters. We insulate ourselves around with others who are like-minded. We stay away from the people that are causing conflict. You know, if you've gotten a negative email or two from a parishioner, chances are they're not the ones that you want to go and make small talk with on Sunday mornings. And what happens is that chasm gets larger and larger. So then we begin to ignore the person, or we ignore the situation, or to be visibly anxious about the issues. So my final thing is a quote here for you. Listening is so much an important part of this. Remember, learn, listen, and lament. And when we listen through the conflict, we are able to just be rid of the deadness that has gotten us to that place. And it's enough to resuscitate the spirit and resuscitate a church. I've seen it happen. I've been privileged to share a number of times with churches that have been in that spot and have come out of it in a new place, ready to, grow disciples again for Christ. So what questions do you have? No questions.
Questions, come on. I'm sure there's a couple. Karen, I know you were doing some visioning last year and coming together with your mission for your church. I'm sure there was no conflict when you tried to do that. Was there any conflict that you had there? I mean, that's a...
Yeah, kind of resetting a vision in a church can be a source of conflict. I'm thinking about 2021 though,
Okay.
and the kinds of conflicts that churches are going to find themselves wrestling with. One of that may be about limited resources, so we all have budgets. And as the year progresses, there's a chance that things are going to get even tighter for individual families. And so we might have to make decisions about what we can afford and what we cannot. And helping, some of the questions that we identified tonight are those that can really help a church move in the direction that you want them to.
I think Nina's got a question.
Yes.
Nina's raising her hand.
No, I don't have a question.
Oh, you know, oh, sorry. Okay. You're raising your hand.
Sorry.
And I just published the poll results too, so you can see that also. But conflict, everybody's experts on conflict, no questions.
Well, let me just share this. If we're offering some coaching services through the Mid-Atlantic Foundation, and we're going to continue to be providing a Financial Leadership Academy. The fourth iteration of that is going to begin in November. And because of the major changes that have occurred in churches over the last year or so, as they begin to meet again come spring and summer, there will be conflict in a majority of them because it's going to be different. The research shows that, giving is going to be down by 40%, and that the congregations themselves will be diminished. And so it's going to mean a resorting. And so a big part of the Financial Leadership Academy that will begin in the fall for clergy, will include a portion about conflict. So I just invite you to think about being a part of that if you haven't been before. And you might really value the opportunity to collaborate with colleagues and learn some new skills along the way, particularly
Very enriched.
Yeah.
Very enriched environment with a lot of fertile ground. There's a lot of great ideas shared, and it's like Sally gave us a question. Sally, I'll read it then. As we begin to think about what things will look like when we regather, how can we frame things to initiate the least conflict at the outset?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a statement of "we are" is always powerful. This is what we've been through together. So it's stating what may be obvious, but having, even putting it in his liturgy. We've been through some rough storms together, but just as the storms were stilled by Jesus on the Sea of Galilee so he can calm our storms. Together, we're going to figure out a path forward. So that, using the scripture to kind of set the framework, and then saying, we have, just making those broad statements about what we're going to do, what we've been able to do well, and how we can do more of it is the place to start.
That's awesome. That's great. Good.
Karen is right. This year, as a DS, I tend to face more conflicts because of limited financial resources. So pastors, face some conflicts from church leadership, and even I had recently a special church conference on voting to vote on the new salary would cut with the request from church leadership. So they unanimously passed voted on the significant cut of pastor salary. So that specific pastor actually has never been proactive. For instance, looking at financial resources, where they are, what they can do. Like only if that pastor had some kind of proactive conversation, looking ahead, was what they have, what they don't have, or what they are missing. So zero conversation. So congregation got mad about, and started to doubt the pastor's leadership, all this. So it got elevated and escalated in terms of conflict in the church. So it's not just one, and it's kind of, I this year I tend to handle more cases. So we have more pastors here, so I truly encourage you to look at the status quo of your resources and structure, as Karen said, and values in terms of assessment. It's very, very important. In the end, it's your trouble that tends to become, So yeah, very. I always believe, the conflict, it has to conflict resolution is a proactive, approach, and God's opportunities to turn this crisis, whatever problems, into God's opportunities. That's what I think we are called to believe in that, and through the Bible, actually. So be proactive, it's very important. And who knows, and I will be retiring soon from the cabinet in 4 months. But, as Karen said, in fall, you may have a special church conference on pastors' compensation. And I would hate, no fun to lead that kind of church conference.
Right. And, I love what you said, Reverend Sa, about being proactive. The field of conflict management, conflict transformation has changed significantly over the years. And it's all about helping people figure out how to be proactive in their own conflict, rather than call on outside assistance. Just engage the leadership in a way that they can manage and solve their own conflict in a way that's healthy. The church then feels great about itself, feels empowered. And then any conflict that comes its way, they'll be ready to handle. And it's just so refreshing for congregations when they can do that. The pastor might use a coach to help get that going. But when a church, leadership takes it and works together on it, it's amazing the power and the energy that can occur as a result.
Right.